Energy Transition, episode 44. Our topic today is big banks and ESG. Irina Slav and David Blackmon, good morning.
Good morning and good afternoon.
Good morning.
Good morning. Irina, please, is there a specific reason some banks are leaving net zero efforts, ESG efforts?
Well, 3 US banks said earlier this year that they will be leaving a UN-affiliated net zero alliance because they were threatened by the UN to be kicked out of it unless they, obligated their clients to reduce their exposure to oil and gas. But right now, some US asset managers are, pulling away from ESG because Republicans in Congress are investigating possible, anti-monopoly legislation violations. I'm sure David would say a lot more than me because he knows more about it. But the thing is that some banks and asset managers, including Vanguard, the biggest in the world, are kind of cooling towards ESG investing.
David, is that, let's see, a political decision or is that a strategic decision?
Well, I think it's both, actually. There has been considerable political pressure from the Republicans in Congress, and they'll now have a majority in the House of Representatives and will be able to control the hearing and investigation agenda, which is an important aspect of all this. And then you've had states like Texas and Florida and North Carolina and on and on and on, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and others, threaten, not just threaten, but actually take action against BlackRock, Vanguard, and others, if they discriminate in their investing decisions against the oil and gas industry and the coal industry, as in North Carolina. And that's, causing some of these banks to have to forego billions upon billions of dollars in investments. I think BlackRock alone has $8 billion invested in Texas teachers' retirement funds alone in Texas. And so you've seen things like Larry Fink pretending that his company doesn't discriminate against fossil fuel projects when we all know it does. And Vanguard pulling out of that ESG alliance, and Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, very vocally saying, this is a bad way to go. We need to invest more in these oil and gas projects, in particular natural gas. And so there is considerable momentum. And then the other side of it is non-political, is that the ESG funds haven't performed well this year because they don't invest in oil and gas. And oil and gas has been by far and away the best performing sector in the U.S. economy this year because of the high commodity price environment. And so if you're not invested in oil and gas this year, you're losing money. And that's what Vanguard has recognized. And, I think that some of these other firms are as well. And we saw that report in Reuters this morning that the net result is that this is the first year in a decade in which more money flowed out of ESG related funds than flowed into them during 2022.
But may be related to probable low returns or long-term, too long the time to return. What exactly?
Yeah, I mean, you have an extended return on your investment. And, everybody, at the end of the day, these are financial funds that are supposed to be focused on maximizing returns. And when investors aren't getting that, they're going to pull their money out of them. And gosh, half the American population is invested in some of these funds.
Yeah, that's right. JB, probably he cannot come to our...
ESG is dreadful. No one ever bothers about the S&G.
Yeah, it's true. Well, they don't really bother about the E in the ESG.
Yeah,
right. The E is killing the West, as you know.
It's killing animals as well. Just today I saw on Twitter a petition from a conservation society from Australia calling for people to add their signatures to this petition because of a large-scale wind power project that will involve clearing acres and acres of land, which land is habitat for various animal species. So basically, the E in ESG is
Yeah.
affecting biodiversity and not in a positive way. So there's
Mm,
that too. And I'm really glad that conservationists are beginning to speak up. Well done and keep it up, please.
yeah.
Better late than never. Wind
Yes.
farms have been decimating the migratory bird populations along the Texas Gulf Coast now for the last 5 to 8 years as they've been installed, and we're seeing dramatic declines in the populations of migratory bird species, which on the Gulf Coast of Texas has the biggest diversity on Earth of migratory bird species, and they're being severely harmed by these big wind farms. So I'm glad to see conservationists weighing in because they've remained silent for far too long. And unfortunately, so many of these are already in place, and just
Mhm.
the one in Australia is a wonderful example. The government's going to permit the installation of that thing, but they're going to force them not to generate for 5 months every year in order to protect the orange breasted parrot, which is a severely endangered species there in Australia. So, I mean, they're so dangerous to the bird populations that now you have governments refusing to allow them to operate during migratory bird seasons.
But at the same time, Miriam and David, HSBC is leaving gas and oil projects.
Yeah.
What's the
Yeah.
reason?
Well, they were pressured by their shareholders. But it's funny because they're actually only pulling out of new projects, like all other banks have done, by the way. Okay, we won't invest in new oil and gas projects. But they're sticking with the project that they are already invested in. And there was also another caveat in this pull out from oil and gas that it only concerns, I think, specific projects, which means they can still invest in oil and gas companies if they're not investing in specific projects
Project.
related to new exploration. I mean, they're trying to, it's a bit ridiculous, trying to keep your activist shareholders happy without compromising your profits, the profits you would otherwise lose, as David said, with regard to asset managers. It's becoming a fine balancing act, and I really don't think they should bother so much, banks and asset managers, but I see they're beginning to realize they don't need to bother so much. I mean, if Jamie Dimon was so blunt about investment in oil and gas, it's probably only a matter of time before others follow as well, because he did it and he survived. And he hasn't been forced to resign from
Right.
the helm of JP Morgan for saying this.
Yeah.
So that's a good sign, I think.
It is a good sign, and J.P. Morgan's kind of the elephant in the living room in the banking community in the United States. And so when you basically have the most influential, biggest bank in the country moving in that direction, you would think others would probably follow. It's different in Europe because political pressures are different in Europe. And I think that, that's why the HSBC decision, even though it's highly qualified, wasn't real surprising. And I had to laugh, Arena, because the spokesman for the company cited as part of the rationale last year's July 2021 report by the IEA saying that we need to stop new investments in all oil and gas projects immediately. And so, and so they're citing Fatih Birol as the genius behind their posturing. So
The same words that would basically take him back a few months later. Yeah.
you're
No,
right, exactly.
a lot of people actually, a lot of people, including I think BP, but I may be mistaken, they cite this roadmap to net zero that the IEA published last year as,
Right.
you know, one reason why they're making these decisions. But the case of HSBC is even funnier because was it last year they pulled out of coal totally?
Yeah.
They're not
And
going to
this year
invest in
we
coal.
have record use of coal globally.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
That's right.
I mean,
But
someone is biting themselves right now at HSBC, but well, that's life.
But Europe accepts better ESG than United States. Is it true?
Well, yeah, I mean, the activist investors are much more aggressive down here, and they have the full backing of the governments.
Yeah.
And the courts, as we saw in the lawsuit against Shell, the lawsuit that led to a court ruling that forced the company to reduce its oil and gas production by 45% until, what was it, 2030.
Right.
So Shell has been practically forced to produce less oil and gas.
Which is their
Yeah.
The
business.
environmental organization took it to court, and the court ruled in favor of the environmentalists. I mean, they have everything on their side in Europe.
But here's the irony of that situation, okay? Because what is Shell doing to reduce their equity production of oil? They are divesting non-core assets, selling them to smaller companies who probably won't have the capital to invest nearly as much in reducing emissions from those properties as Shell has, right? And so
Yeah.
the net environmental result of that high-minded court decision in the Netherlands is most likely going to be a higher level of emissions from those exact properties that Shell will be divesting. And it's just part of the whole insanity and lack of logic behind the entire movement.
Absolutely. And even if Shell reduces its oil and gas production, as its CEO Ben van Beurden said, somebody else will produce this oil because there is demand for it.
Mhm.
Yes.
There will be no positive effect on emissions from oil and gas production just
Yeah,
because
sure.
one big oil company was forced to cut its production.
Another
Yeah,
one will put
and
us.
that's something even the IEA recognizes, right? Because they just last week or week before last, they issued this report projecting that demand for crude oil is going to be all-time high this year and is going to continue at that level through at least 2025. This oil is going to be produced by someone, people.
Yeah, exactly.
you know,
If
and
there's demand, there
as
will
much
be.
as I love to make fun of Shell, they do a pretty good job of minimizing their emissions.
Yeah, you are mentioning Shell, but among other companies, big companies, Chevron, Exxon, Repsol, I don't know, Total Energies, which of them are investing in ESG or leaving oil and gas production? What's the map for these big oil
Well, the
companies?
European super majors are very, very ESG oriented. I mean, they've been buying, um, EV charger
Yeah,
producers and investing in batteries and in wind and solar, especially wind in Europe. They have been very, very active in this respect. They're also investing they're bidding for wind energy projects in the United States, I think,
Yep.
because they have the means. And I think the chief executive of BP said it, that they'll be using money they make from the sale of oil and gas to invest in renewables, which is probably ethically unclear. But there hasn't been a lot of criticism on that yet. But
Yeah.
they're really trying to give the impression that they are making their own transition and trying to become, they've changed their names. BP is now supposed to mean Beyond Petroleum. Total became Total Energies. I don't even want to talk about Statoil, and
yeah,
it's switched to Equinor, stupidest name ever.
yeah.
But it is really, they had to pay a veterinarian for the name of his practice.
Yes, it's
Yeah,
a
didn't you
terrible
know
name.
that?
I
Terrible
did
Yeah,
name.
not
yeah,
know that. No.
yeah. So they're very active in, transitioning, but just how far they would transition, I think still remains to be seen, because, I mean, activist pressure only goes this far. And this year, this pressure has been, blunted, because shareholders of big oil companies are not as willing to vote for climate resolutions and for net zero commitments as
Yeah.
they were in previous years.
Mhm.
And that's,
because of oil prices and gas prices. And
right. And we're in a crisis now, and
exactly.
we're in a crisis. It always dampens the enthusiasm for these kinds of things.
Yeah,
Um,
finally.
and next year we're going to have a bigger crisis, being an even bigger crisis than we're in right now. And I suspect it'll be another year in which enthusiasm for all this becomes lower within certain companies and certain banks. And to BP and Shell's credit, 10 years ago, they talked about all the doing all these renewable things a lot, but they didn't really invest any real money in them.
Mm.
Now, I mean, they're at least investing sizable chunks of their capital budgets in doing these things. And where Exxon and Chevron probably aren't doing it to such an extent, but ExxonMobil is spending billions of dollars on their own low carbon ventures company that's really focused mainly on carbon capture and storage and not on buying wind farms and solar panels. And that's just their way of getting to their carbon reduction goals. And Chevron has its own program. But when you really look at their announcements, their fourth quarter results announcements and plans for next year, they're both Chevron and ExxonMobil are planning huge increases in capital spending on oil and gas projects because they, like everyone else, can see that global demand for oil is going to continue to rise, and they're going to work to meet that demand. And because they're all companies at the end of the day.
Exactly.
How much of the capex of these big companies are being applied to renewables? You know that a number?
What was it? BP said that they were committing $5 billion over the next 3 years or something like that. So I mean, it's over $1 billion, where 10 years ago it might have been 100 million in a year.
Yeah, but activist investors are still not happy because it's
Right.
a fraction of their oil profits,
Right.
especially this year. I mean, they did
Yeah.
make a lot of profits on higher gas prices and oil prices. But I'm beginning to think that activist investors and environmental organizations will never be happy
No, they never will.
until super majors, spend 100% of their
Right.
capex on renewable energy.
Yeah, it's a
Irina,
game they can't win.
yeah,
They
yeah,
Exactly, they can't win.
you can win. Irina, you had an article related to plastics. How banks and investors are seeing plastics and petrochemical products replacing by renewables? I mean, uh, leaving oil and gas and going to renewables. How are they uh, seeing
I
this
wouldn't
issue?
know, but I remember a few years ago, before the pandemic, took over headlines and strategies and everything. A lot of forecasters from the banking sector and from elsewhere said that the long-term future of the oil and gas industry is in petrochemicals. And Aramco began building several petrochemical projects, I think one in Malaysia, in India, but it later pulled out of that. But this was the general idea that with the advent of renewables, with the electrification of everything, the oil industry could only have a long-term future thanks to petrochemicals, that oil demand would decline significantly and petrochemicals would be basically the only source of income for these companies. Yeah, it sounds funny in hindsight, I
Yeah.
know. But at the time, it did sound very credible because all these forecasts for lower and lower and dropping oil demand were very, they sounded very authoritative. But right now, nobody's talking about plastics except people like the Secretary General of the United Nations, who said they threaten our human rights. But that's just talk. I mean, life as we know it would be impossible without plastics.
Exactly. And there are
It's the
no
truth of
truly
it.
viable, scalable
No,
alternatives to
no, no.
them. And I mean, yes, there's problems, obviously. I mean, you have the whole ocean cleanup issue. And I wish the Secretary General would be more targeted in his comments and talk about the fact that irresponsible disposal and lack of
Exactly.
recycling of plastics is a threat and an environmental threat. The plastics themselves, if used the right way and disposed of properly and recycled as much as they can be recycled, are not a threat to humanity. And it's just a silly thing for the Secretary General to be saying.
David, you mentioned reduction of carbon from some big oil companies are doing efforts in this. How does it work exactly? Do you have more information?
Well, to the extent that they can lower emissions from their, scope one emissions from their own operations,
In the production
everybody
phase?
in the production phase and the transportation and refining, all aspects of their business, and ExxonMobil has a very active chemicals business as well. And so they've all worked, put a lot of focus on reducing scope one and then scope two emissions as well. The problem they get to is trying to account for scope three emissions, where you have to try to go, somehow account for how people are actually using your products
Yeah.
and the emissions, that come from third party usage of your products, which is, just a ridiculous enterprise that can't really be accurately done. Frankly, when I talk to people, and I wrote a story about Pure West Energy over the weekend and their efforts to quantify and be more transparent about their own ESG efforts, even accounting accurately for scope one emissions is really a very hit and miss enterprise. And the government knows that, and the banks know that, and activist investors know that. And so an awful lot of what happens in that space is estimates and equations that have been approved by bureaucrats at the EPA. And it's not really an accurate measurement of what's really happening. And one thing Pure West found out when they installed, and they've installed hundreds and thousands of monitors on all of their well sites in Wyoming, is that they were double reporting a huge portion of their emissions. And so they were massively over reporting, and the installation of all these monitors just really helped immeasurably in reducing their own reported transparent carbon footprint. And so it's all a very inexact science. And, you don't hear people talking about that aspect of it very much.
Well, no, the problems are never talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Grand finale.
Petrochemicals go beyond.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Medic
I mean,
pharma.
thousands of products made from petrochemicals.
What do you mean
Women without
women go
makeup.
without makeup? We're fine without makeup.
Exactly. People foregoing prescriptions is another thing.
But yeah, medicines and medical cosmetic products, that's a thing too.
Yeah.
So
And let's talk about just for a second,
Sure.
single-use plastics. They're supposed to be all evil. What about single-use syringes for injections in hospital, or any other single-use piece of equipment that is used in hospitals every day for reasons of sterility,
Right.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, a lot of equipment that we need in hospitals that depends on these products.
And by the
Yeah,
way, a lot of it could be very safely sterilized and reused, except for government regulations requiring it to be single use. But, you could sterilize and reuse an awful lot of those syringes and other equipment that they're classified as single use in the medical profession.
Yeah, but then you better go with metal, you can sterilize it and use it
Right. You can
forever.
sterilize metal too. Yeah,
But
exactly.
there are problems.
Yeah.
So the conclusion should be banks, governments, investors, entities are not telling the truth. Is it correct?
They're not telling the whole truth. No.
Yeah.
They're only telling the parts of the truth that suits the narrative.
Yeah. It's mainly untruth by omission, right?
Yeah.
Not by active commission of dishonesty. But yeah, they don't tell the whole story, and the media doesn't tell the whole story because that's not the approved narrative. And God help anyone who goes against the approved narrative.
And the consequences are conflicts, energy shortage, and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We're living
as
through
we
it
can
right
see.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. This was the latest event of 2022.
Oh yeah.
It was a pleasure having Irene and David every week. Was fantastic.
It's been a
And
great year. Yes.
It
yes,
was. It was.
so
And
we
I
are.
wish everybody, you guys and everyone watching, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year and blessings for the holiday season.
Yeah.
And
Same for
and
me.
for me too. And so we are planning to return on January
9th.
9th.
No,
Perfect. Have a great day, great week. LinkedIn user, someone else more. If
yeah, if you look around every room
Yeah.
you're in throughout the day, everything was touched by the oil and gas industry. Yeah, you can't
yeah,
Yeah.
take a
that's right.
step on your
That's right.
carpet without stepping on an oil and gas product, by the way.
Yeah. Exactly.
So Merry Christmas. Have a great year, and thanks so much for this nice year with you
Thank
both.
you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
See you next year. Have a
All
good,
right.
holiday season.
You too.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye bye.
See ya. Bye.